Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the June 13th, 2024 EMS Interoperability Task Force call, which is the final call of our monthly series that we've been holding over the past year and a half or so. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the NEMSIS TAC's YouTube channel. So if anything comes up during the meeting that you need chopped out of the recording, just let us know. Before we jump into the meeting today, I want to see if we have any new participants with us who have not been on any task force calls in the past. And I know for sure we have David Pyke with us. So Dave, if you could introduce yourself. And then after Dave, if there's anyone else who's new, just go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Dave?
I am Dave Pyke. I am the standards architect for Point Click Care. I work for Audacious Inquiry, a Point Click Care company. You may know me as the technical architect for the Test Exchange Framework or in Common Agreement, otherwise known as TEFCA. I'm also the technical director for the Fire at Scale Task Force for ONC and a handful of other things in my spare time. It's good to be here.
All right, thank you. And anyone else who's here for the first time?
Yeah, this is Dave Hill from the MITRE Corporation. Work on a number of different things, including Fire at Scale Task Force, Da Vinci, Karen, Helios, and also co-founder of the Passio project, which focuses on post-acute care.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thank you, Dave. Got our Daves today. All right. Any other new attendees?
Hi, this is Brooke Burton. I think I've been on one or two of these meetings throughout the year, but I am with the National EMS Quality Alliance and the National EMS Management Association.
Thanks, Brooke. Okay, last call. Anyone else? All right. Well, welcome. Okay, so for, as I said, this is the last of our monthly EMS Interoperability Task Force calls. We started up in February of last year and have covered a ton of topics. It's been a great help. I really appreciate all the help that all of you have provided through the conversations we've had to help figure out EMS interoperability, figure out the next steps that we need to take. And after this task force call, we're not ending the work, but we've got the work cut out for us. We know the path forward. We know what things we need to do. And so we'll be busy at work trying to implement everything that we've learned through this task force. Well, today we're going to focus on next steps for TEFCA and next steps for NEMSIS. So these will be the topics that we'll run through today. First, the next steps for TEFCA support for outcomes queries, and we'll have David Pyke helping us with that conversation. Then we're going to move on to challenges to incorporating outcome data into NEMSIS exports to make sure we get outcome data all the way to the national EMS database. And then wrap up with what we anticipate will be some needed changes to the NEMSIS standard in the future to improve interoperability. These would be changes in the eOutcome section of NEMSIS. And then wrap that up with just next steps, what to expect from the NEMSIS TAC over the next few months and the rest of this year. Okay, so let's dive into the first of these topics, which will be around the TEFCA support for operations queries. And just to kind of set the context here, as we look at this sequence diagram that we've looked at for many months now, I've outlined all the portions of the sequence diagram where EMS interacts with some kind of health information network, and it queries the network to look up a patient, to get their demographics, to find medical summaries on them, to then send the EMS report to the hospital. All of that, the purpose of use for those exchanges would be considered treatment, because EMS is treating a patient and they're taking the patient to a hospital who's treating that patient. Then after the call, as we know, we want EMS to be able to get the discharge summary from the hospital to know, what was the actual diagnosis on the patient and some other information, so that EMS can figure out if they, treated that patient appropriately, if they accurately recognized what was going on in that situation. And because they're done treating the patient, this is now considered a purpose of use of healthcare operations. In TEFCA, other participants in the network are required to respond to treatment purpose of use queries, but they're not required to respond to a query where the purpose of use is healthcare operations. So we're looking at, how do we address that going forward? And so we brought in David Pyke, and he and I have had some conversations over the past few weeks to try to figure out the options, try to figure out maybe what our possible next steps are so that we can ensure that if EMS agencies are participating in TEFCA, that they can not only get all the treatment stuff, but they can get those hospital outcomes after the EMS call. So I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to walk us through some of the considerations and options. And then I really encourage you to bring up, discussion and feedback, and together we can kind of figure out what our next steps are going to be. So David, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so for EMS outcomes, again, as Josh said, getting treatment information when you're bringing them to the hospital, that's not an issue. That's treatment, straightforward. It's afterwards when you become the healthcare operations. So once you've dropped them off, the patient has been discharged, you want to do follow-up, getting a healthcare operations query in place has to be worked out, right? How EMS is going to be included in the HCO realm in TEFCA has to be determined. Now, the biggest issue for TEFCA is right now that healthcare operations, except for specific use cases, is not going to be required response. So if you send a query and it's not required response, it is entirely up to the payer, practitioner, whoever you send it to decide whether they respond. Now, care coordination or quality improvement, HEDIS scores, that kind of thing, that may be required because, well, everybody needs to do HEDIS. But that's all still in discussions. As of yet, there has been no publication of the healthcare operations SOP. That is the standard operation procedure. It is an addition to the common agreement on how, and details how things will work for different use cases. So let's go to the next slide. So if we want to be included, if you want EMS, there's two specific methods. So the first one would be creating a special purpose of use code called a sub-XP that applies only to EMS. That's got some challenges because, well, I'll go into them in a minute. Otherwise, you can just use the generic healthcare operations code. Now, the generic code is not likely to require response for an extended period, possibly years, simply because there is so much to be considered, and a lot of providers and such are just sitting there going, hey, we don't want just anybody grabbing our data under HCO. We want to have more control of that. If we do it as a specific code, say t-hco.ems, for example, that requires a specific implementation guide, or ONC could say, hey, guys, do it. But that still wouldn't be required for an extent, not as long, because once we have, what we need to define that use case, it can be much shorter. We just need to get buy-in. We need to make sure that people have implemented the implementation guide so that people can get the information formatted the way you want it. It's still going to be, an extended period, but not as long as the generic. Let's go on to the last one, and then I'll start doing questions. So next slide. There we go. So to do it either way, we're going to need a couple of things. First and foremost, we need a HIPAA-like this definition of what an EMS practice and practitioners are. We need to make sure that we can say this is an EMS provider, this is not. Because if we can't say that, we can't create either way. We can't include that because you just become part of the great mass of possible HCO organizations. So something to define what EMS practice and practitioners means. I did a look through legislation, and things tell me what emergency management system is, but I wasn't able to find a specific definition of what a practice and practitioners are. That is, of legislated quality or regulation quality. So that needs to be created. Or if somebody knows of one that is, again, HIPAA-like, so it is very definitive in the way it's said, please bring it forward. We'd be happy to look at that. If we're going to do a sub-XP, as I said, we need an implementation guide. There needs to be fire and CDA, preferably both, but if only one exists, let's make it fire, because of course that's where ONC wants the world to go. But CDA can be used in the short term if it's used. Now I know that the PCR and PCS is working through the IG profiles. We'll see how that works. I know they're just going into the comment period, so we'll see what comes out of that. The biggest thing, and that's one of the basic requirements of TEFCA, is information has to be tied to US CDI, and that's the US code system for data interchange. That has a big impact on you, and Josh will go into it a little later, because you specify ICD-10, and that's not used that often. CPT and SNOMED need to be used for procedures. SNOMED is dominant for conditions, although ICD-10 is acceptable. So you're going to have to either have some kind of mapping system or some kind of way of doing interchange that sends the information out in the US CDA vocabularies with the US CDI, sorry, not US CDA, US CDI information and elements. That is going to be the biggest change. You can't force, providers and payers to give you information in the format you want. It has to be in the format that's regulated. So V1 immediately, if it's in the short term, V3, because that's what ONC is mandated for 2026 on. So that's going to be the biggest challenge. But if these three things can be done in reasonably short order, then exchange through TEFCA is possible. We will have to work with the RCE. We'll have to work with, ONC to make these definitions work, make sure that providers, QHINs, all the people through system can work with this, and then it starts happening. So that's the biggest thing. So we will go to the questions because there's a whole bunch of them popping up. So we'll just start it with the ones I've got. Matt always has to have the questions. Matt Beckers asks, why wouldn't this fit into the TEFCA subcode for quality improvement, process improvement? Because it may, but the primary use case for that is payers and providers. Those are still in discussion. If we are going
so just to set the stage, Dave, we've been pushing for EMS to be part of that for a year now. When quality improvement, quality management came up. And so if that's not the case, we're going to have to send more comments in. I understand that it was specifically for as created for HEDIS and other measures, but quality improvement and process improvement entails more than that. And that particular definition inside of HIPAA seems to indicate that we could use it for our purpose.
And that may be the case. I do know that extensive conversations are going on around those specifics. What's included in QA, QI, QM, QS, QR.
Yeah, and I just didn't want to say that to this group that this was the only method that would solve the issue. There are multiple paths here.
Yeah. Again, I was just giving examples. If we can work it in, if we can work it in through another path, so much the better. Laura,
and then just to clarify, go ahead. On the US CDI piece, my understanding, and I'd love you to correct me, is the US CDI requirement for data response is only in draft still. Understood that it's required by certified EMRs, but one of the reasons that we and others push back on that is because certified EMRs aren't the only thing that exists in the world. And so for EMS providers who now have to return data via TEFCA for long-term care, for a lot of different areas that didn't get meaningful use money, including transport, that is what we're pushing back against. I want this group to know that, because you don't necessarily all have certified technology and we're funded to do that. That's what we're pushing back against today. Understood that certified EMRs have to do that by 2026. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to set things clear for folks on.
No, that's great. Thanks, Matt. That again, it may be required that everybody follows it. That's still in discussions. But we'll have to leave that and see where that goes. Again, some of this may fall away if ONC decides that's not the direction they want to go.
Hey,
Okay.
before we jump to Lauren's questions, on this discussion of the quality improvement, process improvement, is that a sub-exchange purpose that's being worked on right now through TEFCA?
It's a sub-exchange being discussed, yes.
Yeah, it's being discussed.
That's probably all I can say on it at this point. I don't know what it covers and what it doesn't. Sorry.
Yeah, what's going to be in the healthcare operations SOP is very fluid. So some they appear, they disappear, they change. We can't say specifically that's going to be. There could be one specific to HEDIS. There could be generic ones at this point. If anybody knows for sure, they know far more than the RCE and ONC put together.
Okay, so yeah, so it sounds like that's still pretty early in discussions. There's nothing that's kind of gone to draft stage or anything yet. Just still trying to figure out what to include. Okay,
Right.
and so if a sub-exchange purpose for QI or PI were to make its way into the SOP, then that could potentially, EMS could potentially point to that and use that sub-exchange purpose for their queries.
It is
It's
potentially
just
possible.
that yeah, okay, we just don't know the likelihood of that making it through.
That still needs the definition of EMS practice or practitioners at the very least, even if everything, the other two bullets wash away because of changes to where things are going, that definition will need to exist. I see a hand up from David Balcom. Welcome. I'm going to butcher your name, David.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Let me put the hand down there. Actually, I kind of just got a little bit of the question answered. You referenced like the terminology challenge, and I was trying to get a little bit of a gauge of how much of a focus or priority or lift the terminology coordination is going to be. Like, does it require a specific terminology coordinator? Like, I guess that would come with experience when finish, when you complete some of the wiring up. So if you were going to do eOutcomes, with a new agency, maybe we definitely want to, champion fire, but maybe they're not ready for it today and they want to work on a CDA or something like that. What do you see as like maybe the load there for terminology coordination or challenges? I guess I'm trying to get a gauge on that and didn't do, if that makes any sense.
That's probably a better question. Josh, you can probably handle that one better than I can.
Yeah, I could address that. So today we'll be talking about changes that we probably need to make to the NEMSIS standard to accommodate the wider variety of terminologies that are actually used in documents today. What we're stuck with today in NEMSIS, of course, we want to try to make that work the best we can. I've published a XSLT transformation to go from a CCDA discharge summary to the NEMSIS eOutcome section. However, it does not tackle that difficult task of translating terminology where it's provided in a different code set. So if the discharge summary has ICD-10 codes for, say, diagnoses, that's great. It processes them in. And if it doesn't have those codes, it just doesn't process them. So that's where that translation stands at the moment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later here. I think for this particular discussion about getting support in TEFCA, I think the foundational things that we can lay out are that we will promise from the EMS side to come to TEFCA ready to receive the data that already exists. So whatever work we need to do there, we'll do that work so that we do not require hospitals to produce something different that they don't already have the ability to produce. So I think that's the kind of the promise we can make from that side. And so it kind of leaves, it narrows the scope here on the TEFCA side to just the one thing, which is, okay, you already have the data we need. We just need to make sure that when we submit that query, we get that response. And we'll take that data the way it already is, but that's the one thing I think that I see that we need to do is just make sure we actually get the response when we submit the query.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Mhm.
The room's gone quiet. I think we can move on to the next thing, and I will bid you all a fond adieu.
All right, and there are a couple questions from Lauren, which we're going to get to. Lauren, those are great prompt questions for a couple of the next topics that we're going to cover today. I want to pause here. David, thank you for covering that topic and kind of how you see that we might move forward. Matt, thanks a bunch for that additional insight about what might be getting considered for the sub-exchange purpose for quality improvement or process improvement. I want to just open it up to all of you. We got to figure out this path forward with TEFCA. It sounds, from what David's saying, it sounds like it's useful for us to identify a definition of an EMS provider or practitioner, the type of people that would be taking a patient to a hospital and submitting these queries for outcomes. I know EMS can do lots of other things, but we can probably come up with a definition that addresses at least this particular exchange purpose of getting hospital outcomes. So that's something that we can work on. Then, continuing to provide maybe some input or feedback on the sub-exchange purpose for QI or PI that might make its way through TEFCA, or the option of a specific sub-exchange purpose for EMS to get hospital outcomes. Anyone, I welcome any of your thoughts on, does it sound like we're kind of hitting the paths that we need to? Are we kind of at the direction we're looking at? Does this look good? What do we need to consider? What have we not thought about? So any comments?
I guess, Josh, this is Dave.
Yeah.
The only other thought was, I know we touched on it briefly, maybe in some of Matt's comments, but the actual exception of EMS to having to declare it as a purpose of use healthcare operations, is that a path that merits any effort, or is that just a dead end?
Let's see. Can you rephrase that a little? I'm not sure I quite understand.
Well, if I'm a primary care provider and I haven't seen you in 10 years, I can do a treatment query against your records. I'm EMS, I've treated you, I've transported you. We could make an argument for how likely it is I'm going to see you again. But is there any argument to be made for an exception to the healthcare operations definition that doesn't apply to EMS, and it's actually a treatment query? It happens to happen, 10 minutes after or 4 days after the treatment occurred. Anyway, I just didn't know if that's a path at all, or just I need to purge that from my brain.
A few others have asked that same question. Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that? So the idea being, hey, can EMS, after the call, after they've been discharged from the hospital, can they just submit it as a treatment query because it was so close to when they provided treatment, or because the other rationale would be that EMS has a defined service area that patient was within, and so next time they call 911, that same EMS agency is going to treat that same patient, things like that. But yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think from a national framework perspective, they are trying to essentially narrow down what treatment looks like, not necessarily expand it. my initial thought to that is we need required responses around the other purposes of use. That's going to be a faster play. To Dane's question, I think that the treatment use, it's certainly up for debate and certainly up for at least a question. And we should pursue both at the same time. But at the same time, my gut is that pushing this up to a secondary purpose of use that is actually accepted is going to be a faster path based on current politics anyway.
Okay. Yeah, and perhaps that's our best long-term position as well, because it makes it very clear in policy that EMS would have access to that data for that purpose. Yeah, other thoughts on that question, or you know, the more generally the paths that we're looking at here for TEFCA? Okay, great. We're going to move to the next topic. So, you know, this will be our marching orders on TEFCA. This is we'll pursue these multiple paths and keep working on them as we go forward. Next topic that we're going to cover today is about getting outcome data. You know, if you are getting outcome data from a hospital, then trying to get that data into your EMS, your NEMSIS XML data that gets submitted to the state and then the national database. You've probably all seen this stat that I've shared widely, that in 2023, hospital outcomes were recorded on 1.4% of patient care reports in the national EMS database, where a patient was treated and transported by EMS. And this is whittling it down to, you know, hospital outcomes other than still a patient at the hospital. So 1.4% is a very small percentage. I mean, it might be, you know, tens of thousands of records in a 50 million record database, but it's still a small percentage. And I'm kind of guessing that if everyone who's getting outcome data today in EMS was actually getting that data inserted into their NEMSIS XML submissions, that we would maybe be sitting around 10% instead of 1.5%. It's just a guess, of course, because we, of course, don't have the data. But we see this as some potential low-hanging fruit, where there are some agencies today that are getting outcome data one way or another. But that outcome data is sometimes just sitting in the agency system and not actually getting submitted with their NEMSIS PCR data to their state or to the national database. So we've identified some barriers to getting that outcome data into the NEMSIS XML documents. And I've written up those potential barriers, as well as some drafted suggestions, guidance, recommendations about how to address those barriers. So I'd like to take the next chunk of our call to walk through this wiki page with all of you to show you the barriers that I've documented and the kind of recommendations that I've drafted, and get your input. So I'm looking for a couple things. One, we're going to go through the barriers that we have documented. At the end of that, if you think of other barriers that we haven't documented yet, please bring those up so we can document them. As we go through each of these barriers, I want to make sure that I've described the barrier accurately and completely. And also, I want your feedback on the recommendations for how to address that barrier. So the first barrier we're going to look at is resubmissions and increased NEMSIS data submission volume. Pump up the text size here. So in a nutshell, this barrier is saying, hey, if we send PCR data to the state from the agency, and then a few days later we get the hospital outcomes, then we need to resend the data to the state. And so that means we potentially double the submission volume going over the internet and going into that state system. because we have to submit that PCR a second time with the outcome data included. And then the state has to turn around and resubmit that to the national EMS database. So again, potentially doubling the volume of transactions on the national EMS database. So that's the barrier. The response to that is kind of partial. That is that the national EMS database hosted by the NEMSIS TAC is prepared to handle this increase in submission volume. It's that simple. It's a priority for the NEMSIS TAC. I say it's a partial answer because we can't really speak on behalf of state EMS offices. So we've put in I put in a sentence here that says that state EMS offices should work with their state vendors to evaluate and test increased submission volume, and they should communicate their level of readiness to their stakeholders. So the states need to put a message out to agencies and vendors saying, yeah, we're ready for that potentially doubling of submission volume, or no, we're not ready for it, or it's important to us, or it's not. So that needs to come from the states. I also documented in this last paragraph that in previous versions of NEMSIS, sometimes a resubmission was actually recognized as a new record or a new report by the state system and by the national EMS database. And so it ended up creating duplicate reports in the national database. As we moved to NEMSIS 3.5, we introduced the universally unique identifier to resolve that issue. So that should be a resolved issue going forward in NEMSIS 3.5. All right, any feedback on this particular barrier and where we are so far with the recommendations and response? Okay, so I hope we're good on that one. Next one, when to trigger resubmission. Hospital data feeds are really chatty. So as the patient moves around within the hospital, it's often the case that the hospital will generate lots of messages indicating the patient movement or additional procedures that have been done or diagnoses that were added. And so one of the questions that came up was, well, how do we know when to go ahead and resubmit that NEMSIS PCR to the state? When do we feel like we have enough of the hospital data from that patient's visit? So that's the barrier. The guidance that we've drafted up here is that the ePCR system can go ahead and process hospital outcome data as it's receiving it from the hospital. It can kind of update that within its own database. Once it has received a message or document from the hospital that includes a hospital discharge disposition, that would be a good trigger point to say, okay, let's go ahead and resubmit the PCR to the state. Now, it's not perfect. The hospital may put out a document that has a discharge disposition, and then over the next several days or weeks, they might clean up the diagnosis codes or things like that. But this gets it's kind of the practical, pragmatic approach to getting most of what would have happened in the hospital. And then the second point here in the guidance is if the ePCR system has received hospital data, but it's been 2 weeks and it still hasn't received one that has a discharge disposition, it's entirely possible the hospital might have the patient for 3 or 4 weeks before they're discharged. But I've heard and understand that a lot of hospitals will tend to kind of stop providing the data after a certain period, a week or two. They'll just stop providing the data at that point. So this recommendation is, hey, if it's been 2 weeks and you haven't gotten anything else, then go ahead and send what you have. So any feedback or comments or thoughts on this particular barrier and the drafted guidance here?
Hey, Josh.
Brent Myers from ESO.
Yeah,
I
Brent.
think one of the difficulties there is your complex patients for which many people would be interested in the ultimate outcome might well be excluded. So I think the way to say this is the streaming of data elements, many hospitals feel like, your blood pressure in the ICU on the 14th day is hard to say is minimum necessary for EMS, right?
Yeah.
However, the ultimate disposition and diagnosis is pertinent for EMS. And so I do think there's something we need to think through about that 2-week number. Just because, hopefully not, but many of your, cardiac arrests, certainly your major traumas, may have a length of stay above 14 days.
Great comment. Maybe I could update the guidance a little bit to indicate that, if it's been 2 weeks, send what you have. But then down the road, if you do finally get a discharge disposition, then go ahead and resend again.
Josh, if I can throw one extra piece in.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil. Oops, we might have lost your audio, Neil.
To us, and it would capture a much higher
Neil,
percentage.
your audio was dropped for a while. You want to start over?
Sorry about that. So many of our hospital specialty care committees submit to various national databases, and they're usually 30, 60, or 90 days behind, specifically because of these issues with length of stay. So a 14-day may be optimal for quick response, but I think if we're looking to minimize the number of messages, if you go out to a 60 or 90-day, that is probably going to be a more optimal way of doing it to minimize those extra messages, as well as accounting for the 21 business days for billing to change codes to finalize them for submission, where ICD codes may get tweaked as well. So going out to that larger number is probably going to be a better bet and consistent with other healthcare activities.
Okay, great. Thank you. Brent, I don't know, did you have anything more to say? I want to make sure we didn't cut you off.
Oh, no, not at all. No, thanks.
Okay. And did someone else have a comment?
Oh, that was me, Josh, but Neil answered the question comprehensively, so thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, that was great info from Neil. I think I can update this guidance to provide a little more information about, how registries, the timeframes that they use, and then the timeframes that are used for billing. So that's really helpful. All right, any other comments on this particular hurdle? Okay, so the next one is parsing code sets. The NEMSIS eOutcome section requires data to be in certain formats. For example, ED and hospital discharge dispositions, they have to match one of the 2-digit codes specified by the NEMSIS standard. So 01 being discharged to home and so on. Hospital procedures have to be ICD-10 PCS. Hospital diagnoses have to be ICD-10 CM. And what we're seeing in actual data is that hospitals will often use SNOMED for procedures for diagnoses. They'll use CPT codes. So there's a variety out there in addition to ICD-10. The current recommendation that I've drafted is, if there's an ICD-10 code, send that in the NEMSIS XML. Certainly, take any code you get. You can present that to your users at the agency level. They'll understand what the diagnoses were and so on. But when you have to send that data out in NEMSIS XML format, you can only send the codes that match what NEMSIS allows. So it's going to be those ICD-10 codes and so on. I'm going to show you just an example of what this can look like. So here's a screenshot of a procedure in a clinical document architecture format. And you'll notice that this procedure has a code, and that code system is SNOMED. So the particular code here, 6025007, that's a SNOMED code that represents a laparoscopic appendectomy. Well, the producer of this document can also provide translation entries, and that's what they've done here. So they've provided a code of 44970 that's from the CPT code system, and they've provided the name of that. They've also provided a translation that uses ICD-10 PCS. So the 0DTJ4ZZ, that's the ICD-10 PCS code. That's the one code among all of these that can fit valid into a NEMSIS eOutcome data element for a procedure that was done at the hospital. They've also provided here an ICD-10-9 translation as well, or ICD-9, sorry, translation. So sometimes you see that, and that's great when you do. So even if they used SNOMED, as long as they provided a translation to ICD-10 PCS, then you can send the ICD-10 PCS code in the eOutcome section to the state database and then on to national. But if they didn't provide that translation to ICD-10, then it can't go out. You can't send the SNOMED code. It wouldn't be valid according to the NEMSIS standard. So that's something we're going to talk about, things we need to fix in NEMSIS. That's one of them. But what I've written up for now is basically, if you can find a code that's in the code set that NEMSIS wants, go ahead and grab that code and send it. I think I can also probably add a little content here talking about terminology mapping services. So if you have access to a terminology mapping service, then you could potentially query that mapping service and get a translation from some of their code set to the one that you need for NEMSIS. So I'll add a little bit about that. Any other thoughts from the group on these various code sets that aren't supported by NEMSIS, and what we would recommend today that people can do to handle this?
Hey, this is David again.
Yeah.
I just had asked that question earlier because I learned a lot about terminology coordination as a niche in, health IT and so forth, and in the hospital with these various code sets where they're generating reports, whether it's a research report or a clinical report or an administrative report, data can be different. And so we really valued the ability to be able to translate across those, but the standards needed to support. So this looks like there is going to be a lot of focus on terminology coordination. And the bigger an agency is, or a project might be, then obviously the bigger that lift will be. I just wanted to add that in there from my perspective as an engineer. So.
Yeah, this is directly related to that question you asked earlier. And yeah, as you can see, the answer is yes. Terminology mapping, there's a role for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and like as an engineer, we're so far upstream from how the data shakes out. This is like where it's really important that we set these right, and the standardization helps everybody downstream see it the same. So
yeah. Great. Any other thoughts on parsing the code sets? Okay. The next to last one that we've identified so far is fitting admission/working/discharge into the NEMSIS structure of ED versus hospital categorizations. So the NEMSIS eOutcome section, for example, looks for emergency department diagnoses and for hospital diagnoses. What I've heard is that in the hospital environment, it's more common that you're going to see an admit diagnosis, you're going to see working diagnoses, and then at the end they figure out the discharge diagnoses. What was it all in the end when we got everything settled? So the recommendation here, at least using the current version of the NEMSIS standard, is that if you can identify clearly that a particular diagnosis or procedure was from the ED, then go ahead and put that in the ED procedure or ED diagnosis elements in the NEMSIS eOutcome section. If you can't figure out definitively that it was from the ED, that's okay. Just put it all in the hospital diagnoses or hospital procedures. That's what I've got so far. Any comments thoughts on this particular barrier? Okay, got that one covered. And the last one is multiple. Oh, sorry, no, there's one more after that. Multiple hospital encounters. So a patient gets transported by EMS to hospital A. They get packaged up and then they get interfacility transported to hospital B, that's a higher level of care, to get their definitive care. The NEMSIS eOutcome section only allows for data from one hospital to be recorded. It's not a one-to-many kind of setup. So when you have multiple hospital visits all associated with this one patient care report, then what do you do? Well, certainly the local EMS agency may want to receive all of that data and understand what happened at the multiple hospitals the patient went to. When it comes time to export that data in NEMSIS XML format, what do you include in the eOutcome section? The recommendation here is to include the outcomes from the hospital that immediately followed the EMS encounter. So if the agency transported to hospital A, then when they send their NEMSIS data with outcomes included, they're going to include the outcomes from hospital A on that patient care report. If they did an interfacility transport later, then the outcomes from hospital B would be inserted into the patient care report that covered the interfacility transport. So once it all gets to the state or the national database, then the outcomes from both hospitals have actually been obtained, longitudinally across the multiple patient care reports associated with that patient. Thoughts on that one? Does that recommendation make sense? Anything we need to clarify there? Okay. This last piece is more of a general. Oh yeah, go aheid.
Sorry, Josh, to interrupt. So what you're saying on that one is that there would really only be one EPCR, one UUID for that patient, even though they were transported to two different hospitals?
No, there could be multiple patient care reports associated with one hospital encounter, and there could be multiple hospital encounters associated with one patient care report. But when you send that patient care report to the state and then the national database, you can only include the outcome data from one of the hospital encounters.
Okay.
Yeah, so the recommendation would be to include the data from the hospital encounter that was most immediately following that patient care report.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the last is just a consideration that people who use outcome data from the national EMS database should not overgeneralize their findings, because it's one thing if you can look at 50 million records and you've got data on a particular thing on 45 million of them, then you've got something that's pretty generalizable. But when you're looking at 50 million records and you've only got hospital outcomes on a sliver of those records, you got to recognize that that sliver is probably only coming from certain agencies, certain hospitals, certain parts of the country. So you got to be careful not to overgeneralize your results and what you're interpreting based on that very small sliver of records that actually have outcome data. So as we looked through these barriers, and I'm just going to go up here so you can see the table of contents for this page, these 5 main barriers that we documented. Any others that come to mind that all of you have run into that we should probably address?
Hey, Joshua, it's Brent Myers. Just one
Yeah.
quick thing just to re-emphasize this notion of EMS being operational in our feedback or in the outcomes portion, the variability of the willingness of hospitals to share certain data elements is pretty profound. So I think to the extent that there can be some encouragement, that would be helpful to share meaningful clinical data, not just, you know, whatever would be operational, which might just be admission date and time and, you know, 2 or 3 other things. I'm concerned that we might get this all flowing and still have less than ideal data for performance improvement.
Right. So that even if the hospital is sending data and like they're sending the document, but the document is missing pieces of information that would be really important to EMS, then we still haven't gotten where we need to be. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Okay, great thoughts. And one page of the wiki site is data elements to be shared. And that particular page kind of outlines what EMS considers important to know from the hospital encounter. So that's a place that we've tried to document that. Others, it looks like there's a couple hands up. Let's see, Bill.
Hey, Josh, sorry, Bill Clark from Colorado here. Probably the least technical person on the line here, but just one of the scenarios that popped up into my mind in regarding outcomes here and maybe a challenge. And please correct me if I'm way off base here, but like for instance, intercepts or, you know, trans-scene flights with flight services and getting that outcome data back to the agency. Is that something from a technical aspect that could be a challenge?
Yeah. So are you saying, for example, a ground EMS agency that then handed the patient to a helicopter? The helicopter took him to the hospital. Now the ground agency is trying to figure out the outcome of the patient.
Yes.
Yeah. We've addressed it a little bit under patient identification. Like how do we actually know, how do we establish the fact that this EMS encounter matches this hospital encounter? Because that link has to be made before you can start sending the data back and forth to say, well, here was the outcomes or here's the EMS report. So that's addressed a little bit in the patient identification page. But I wonder, there might be a little more we could do to address just the fact that the ground agency needs that data, even though they never interacted directly with the hospital staff. That they still need that data because it was their patient that went to the hospital. That might be an area we could add to a little more. So I'm going to jot a note on that.
Thanks, Josh.
And let's see. And David Balcom, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask really quick to tail on that other question, if anyone has had any success in incentivizing the hospitals to provide more e-outcomes. I know regulations will be emerging over the years and we'll all get better at it, but we're relying on them for this data. So I was wondering, before the call closed, I thought I'd ask that question, if we're going to be approaching them for this data and what might be some of those strategies, or if that's a conversation in progress to look for.
I'll mention one thing and I would welcome other thoughts. The NEMSIS TAC did a document with Page, Wolfberg, and Worth that described how you know, some hospitals in the past thought that they couldn't share data with EMS because of HIPAA prohibitions. And so NEMSIS TAC and Page, Wolfberg, and Worth, they did a document talking about HIPAA and how it actually allows for hospitals to share outcomes with EMS. So that kind of tackled it like from the legal side, but I think there's lots of other angles too. So yeah, does anyone else have thoughts on that?
I'm sure that we'll get better at it, but
yeah,
for that.
Yeah, I think for all of us, it's a matter of keeping it keeping the profile up, right? Talking about it often. When you talk to a hospital, talk to them about interoperability. When you talk to an EMS agency, talk about interoperability. Any other barriers that all of you can think of to incorporating outcome data into NEMSIS exports that we haven't covered that we could write up? Okay, well, thanks everyone for your input and feedback on these. I'll make some edits to this wiki page, and we'll probably be looking going forward about how we might turn, this is essentially informal guidance at this point. It's just on a wiki site, and how we might turn that into something more formal that would be, official from the NEMSIS TAC. All right, let's get to our next topic today, which is NEMSIS version changes. And I think this will get to, I think it was Lauren who questioned. NEMSIS version changes. We just, as we've learned more about hospital data and what it looks like, we have identified that we probably need to make some changes to the NEMSIS standard, to the eOutcome section, to make it more interoperable with healthcare data that we're seeing out there. And I've just, drafted up a few examples of the kinds of changes that we will probably need to look at making. One is opening up the eOutcome procedures and diagnoses to multiple code sets. So that was that issue. I showed that example earlier where the hospital is providing the data, maybe not in ICD-10 PCS as NEMSIS wants, but they're providing it in SNOMED or some other code set. So looking at changes to NEMSIS for that. That would have an impact on vendors, because vendors, EMS vendors, these external code sets, you have to support them. If, today you have to support ICD-10, you have to support SNOMED, RxNorm. It means when the updates come out from these standards every few months or every year or every week, you've got to process those updates into your system. You've got to make those codes available, know what they are. So opening up NEMSIS to more code sets means you would potentially need to support those code sets in the eOutcome section data elements. Another change that we might need to look at is right now we've got ED and hospital diagnoses and dispositions. Do we need to transform that structure, re-architect it so that we've got admitting, working, and discharge diagnoses? Or can we really distinguish between ED and hospital procedures, or do we just need all procedures? Some things like that. So we got to think about that. The challenge of allowing outcomes from multiple hospitals. So we've got guidance for what to do now, but an EMS agency would very well want to know what happened at both of the hospitals. And they want both of those hospitals' outcomes attached to their patient care report. That's great. Their vendor can do that today if they build it, but they can't send the outcomes from both hospitals in their NEMSIS export. They can only send it from one hospital. So do we re-architect the outcome section to allow outcomes from multiple hospitals? And then adding any important data elements. So a couple of things I want to look at with you here, just to get a little better sense of what we're potentially talking about. While I'm bringing this up, I'll mention that this would be in a future version of NEMSIS. So not in NEMSIS 3.5.1, which is already closed for input and is being developed right now by the NEMSIS TAC. It would be a future version after 3.5.1. Any changes that were to be made would go through the full public process, be discussed on NEMSIS implementation calls, annual meeting, and so on. Okay, eOutcome. So this is what the section currently looks like. And just to illustrate some of these changes that might need to be made, if we look at them, let's take hospital procedures. All right, so this currently has to be an ICD-10 PCS code. So we might need to update the standard to say that this would also have a new attribute that would indicate the code system that's being used. And then it could allow ICD-10 or it could allow SNOMED, CPT, or others. We'd need to figure out exactly which ones to support based on US CDI requirements. Or if we go back to the grouping here, do we put all of these elements inside of a group and that group can repeat? So then we can get all of these elements from hospital A, and we can also have a set of all these elements from hospital B that the patient also went to. So those are the kinds of changes. I don't expect that we're going to kind of figure all those out on the call today, but I wanted to give you just a kind of a sense of what those changes might be. In terms of adding new data elements, I want to show you where we might pull for that. Whoops, let me get back to the wiki site. When we look at the data elements to be shared, and we look down at the information that should go back to EMS from the hospital. With all of your help, we've documented the important information that is needed from the ED and non-ED portions of the hospital, as well as overall information. And you'll see a few things on here that are not in the eOutcome section of NEMSIS. Now that might be fine, because nothing stops an agency from getting this data if it's important to them and if their vendor has a place to store it. But does it need to be, does the NEMSIS standard need support for these pieces of information? Does it need to be possible to send that information in an export to get to state or national databases? So these are potential things that we would look at that might get added as new elements in the NEMSIS standard. Okay, so that's just a heads up on those. Again, we'll have work to do to figure it all out. But I want to just pause and see if anyone has any questions about the potential scope of changes we might make to NEMSIS. And also, Lauren, if that answered your questions.
Hey, Josh, thinking about like a one-to-many for the eOutcomes, are you thinking associating that with like a destination name or code as well? So it'd be, hospital A, and then the rest of it would be associated with it?
Yeah, probably, because
Registry or-
inside of here, we've got that external data group where you can record like the encounter number from the hospital, but you don't know which hospital it came from.
Right, yeah. Assuming it was the one you transported to.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
if
Today,
it's coming from multiples, then yeah.
Right. Today, the assumption is it's coming from the hospital you transported to. So you get that in the disposition section. So if we make this one-to-many, we can't make that assumption anymore. Yeah. So I think we would need to add something that identifies the hospital that it came from.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments on the NEMSIS version changes? All right, well, we're almost to the end of our call. I want to give you a preview of the stuff we're going to be working on this summer. So I'm building some transformations. The first one has already been published. That's an XSLT that will transform an HL7 V3 CCDA inpatient discharge summary to the NEMSIS eOutcome section. It produces essentially a fragment of a NEMSIS document that includes some patient info and the eOutcome section. This month, I'm going to update that particular transformation so that it will also handle if you got a discharge summary that represents the ED encounter. So an ED discharge summary. One translation will handle both of those cases. So if you throw a discharge summary at it, it'll figure out whether it was an inpatient or ED visit and fill the NEMSIS eOutcome section appropriately. In July, I'll publish a translation that will take data from an HL7 V3 CCDA continuity of care document, which is the most common document format out there today, and grab the data from that and transform it into an eOutcome fragment in NEMSIS. And then in August, I'm going to put out one transformation goes the other direction. This one is going to be very simple, but it's where we're going to start. Take a NEMSIS v3 PCR in NEMSIS format and transform it to a NEMSIS, an HL7 unstructured document. So that doesn't sound like much yet, but it allows me to tackle kind of the header stuff without worrying too much about the content. And then future translations would include transforming a NEMSIS v3 PCR to structured data like a transfer summary, or the HL7 EMS PCR will kind of identify those target formats. Those would come later. These are the ones that'll come out over the summer. The intent with these transformations is twofold. One, you might be able to plug them into a product and you get some data, you run it through the transform, and you get data out that you can store in your NEMSIS data storage. The other is that they serve as a reference. So the documentation for these transformations really kind of clarifies, okay, you know, where do we get hospital diagnoses from? Do we get active or resolved diagnoses from the CCDA? You know, all the little nuances of parsing the CCDA into NEMSIS. This provides a reference implementation for that. So look forward to those coming over the summer. And in terms of next steps, this is our final call of the monthly meeting. We may have calls in the future on an as-needed basis. If we get into a topic where we feel like we're going to need some discussion and input that we can't get over email or otherwise, then we'll schedule a meeting. But this is the final one of the monthly series. You can snap this QR code, or Lisa, if you could put the link in the chat. There you go. There is a quick survey. The survey for this call is a little different than the one for all of the past calls, because it is our final call. So it's got some very specific questions about the topics we addressed today, such as getting TEFCA support for outcome queries. So I would invite you to take maybe, it might take a little longer, maybe 5 minutes this time, to fill out that survey. I want to make sure that we're on track with our path forward. We will continue to keep the Google group alive for email communications, so that will continue to exist. And then, as I said, we might schedule future meetings as needed. I really appreciate the time that all of you have spent essentially donating your time to this effort to, at a national level, figure out how we can improve interoperability for EMS. Your contributions have been fantastic. I know I've learned a ton myself, and I think many of us have learned from each other and have just a better understanding, better picture of the issues going forward and what we need to work on next. So with that, I just want to turn the time over to Clay Mann, who's the principal investigator for the NEMSIS TAC, for any parting thoughts.
Oh yeah, thank you, Josh. I'll just be brief. I echo everything you said, the gratefulness that we have for all of you participating and sharing of your time. This, of course, for us is a tough nut to crack, right? The kind of acceptance and support of EMS care at the federal level is not as what we would like to see. So this has been a really hard process for us to figure out. And as you can see from the work that Josh has provided today, that we feel like we're not running in place anymore, right? Thanks to your direction, we have many action items, many tasks to forward over the next months to make sure that we're aligning most appropriately with the rest of healthcare. So this has been incredibly helpful, and just appreciate all of your time spent. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks everyone for all your contributions on this task force and for attending this final meeting. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and we will be in touch, working hard. Thanks everyone.